The question echoed across the emergency operations room, sharp enough to cut through the chaos. Who shut down the plant? Nobody answered at first. Hundreds of workers stood outside under flashing amber lights. Supervisors barked into radios. Security officers moved quickly through the crowd. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls of the factory, a warning siren continued its slow, haunting cry. Then someone pointed toward a man sitting quietly in a metal chair near the security desk. His wrists were restrained. His work shirt was stained with grease. His eyes were calm. It was him. The room fell silent. No one looking at Ethan Walker would have guessed he had just stopped a multi-million-dollar operation. No one looking at him would have imagined that within the next few hours, some of the most educated experts in the state would question everything they thought they knew. But that part of the story comes later. Because 48 hours earlier, Ethan Walker was simply another forgotten man walking through the gates of Ridgeway Industrial Solutions before sunrise. The morning air carried the scent of rain and machine oil. Massive storage tanks rose against the dark sky like sleeping giants. Floodlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The factory never truly slept. Pumps hummed. Compressors rattled. Steel pipes vibrated with invisible pressure. It was a world of numbers, systems, and schedules. Yet Ethan trusted something far older than technology. He trusted his ears. Every morning at exactly 5:15 a.m., his aging pickup rolled into the employee lot. Every morning, he carried the same dented lunchbox. Every morning, he nodded politely to the security guards, most of whom barely knew his name. Ethan had worked there for nearly 17 years. Long enough to watch managers come and go. Long enough to see young engineers arrive fresh from college with impressive degrees and ambitious plans. Long enough to understand that machines spoke their own language. Most people never learned how to listen. Ethan did. The men on the maintenance crew often joked about it. If a bolt sneezes, Ethan hears it. If a motor gets a headache, Ethan already knows why. They laughed when they said it, but behind every joke was respect. Because more than once, Ethan had noticed problems long before sensors detected them. Long before computer systems raised alarms. Long before anyone else realized something was wrong. He never bragged about it. Quiet strength rarely announces itself. It simply does its work and goes home. And home mattered more than anything to Ethan Walker. Every evening after his shift, he returned to a modest white house on the edge of town. There waited the most important person in his life. His 11-year-old daughter, Lily. Since losing his wife years earlier, Ethan had built his entire world around one promise. Keep moving forward. For Lily, some days that promise felt heavy. Other days it felt like grace. But every day it gave him purpose. On the morning everything began, Ethan entered Processing Building 3 carrying a clipboard and a flashlight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Steam drifted lazily from insulated pipes. Workers moved between stations while forklifts beeped in the distance. Nothing appeared unusual. Everything looked exactly as it should. Yet as Ethan walked past a section of high-pressure transfer lines, he stopped. Just for a moment. His eyes narrowed slightly. Somewhere beneath the familiar chorus of machinery, another sound appeared. Tiny. Almost invisible. A faint metallic click. Then silence. Ethan stood perfectly still. The sound did not return. A passing technician glanced at him. You okay? Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. The technician continued walking. Ethan remained where he was for several seconds longer. Listening. Waiting. The factory continued around him without concern. Conveyor systems moved. Pumps cycled. Valves adjusted. Everything appeared normal. Everything looked safe. Yet a feeling settled deep in Ethan's chest, quiet but persistent. The kind of feeling earned through decades of experience. The kind of feeling that could not be measured by software or spreadsheets. Somewhere inside the maze of steel and pressure, something had whispered a warning. And Ethan Walker was the only person who had heard it. The sound stayed with Ethan for the rest of the morning. Not because it was loud. Not because it triggered any alarm. Quite the opposite. It was so small that most people would have forgotten it within seconds. But experience has a way of turning tiny details into heavy questions. As he continued his inspection route through Building 3, he found himself listening more carefully than usual. Every hiss of steam, every vibration through the floor grates, every rhythmic pulse traveling through the miles of steel pipe overhead. The factory had its own heartbeat. After 17 years, Ethan knew it by memory. and something about today's rhythm felt slightly off. At 10 o'clock, the engineering team gathered inside a glass conference room overlooking the processing floor. Screens displayed production numbers, pressure readings, efficiency reports. Everything looked excellent. Quarterly targets were ahead of schedule. Output was climbing. Profits were strong. Derek Collins stood near the front of the room with the confidence of a man who trusted numbers more than people. At 34 years old, he was one of the youngest engineering managers in company history. Smart, ambitious, respected. He believed every problem could be measured, modeled, and predicted. Ethan waited outside until the meeting ended. As engineers filed out carrying tablets and coffee cups, he stepped forward. "Derek, got a minute?" Derek glanced at his watch. "Make it quick." Ethan nodded. "I heard something unusual near the transfer system in Building 3. Derek gave a faint smile. "Unusual how?" "A clicking sound. Metal on metal. Brief but sharp." Derek folded his arms. "Any sensor warnings?" "No." "Pressure fluctuations?" "Not yet." Derek sighed. "Then what exactly are we talking about?" Ethan hesitated. The answer sounded weak even to his own ears. "A feeling." Several engineers nearby exchanged amused looks. One chuckled softly. Derek shook his head. "Ethan, we have over 4,000 active sensors monitoring this facility 24 hours a day." He gestured toward the operations center visible through the glass wall. "If there is a problem, the system will tell us." Ethan remained calm. "The system has been wrong before." The room grew slightly quieter. Derek's smile disappeared. "And it has been right millions of times." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Derek patted Ethan's shoulder. Not cruelly, not kindly either, just dismissively. "Go finish your rounds. If the machines get worried, I will get worried." The conversation ended there. Yet Ethan walked away carrying a weight that felt heavier than before. Because deep down he had not expected Derek to listen. The younger engineers respected data. Ethan respected patterns. And patterns were harder to explain. That evening, the sun was sinking behind the town when Ethan pulled into his driveway. The old white house glowed softly beneath golden light. Wind moved gently through the maple trees. For a few precious moments, the factory felt 1,000 miles away. Lily opened the front door before he even reached the porch. "You are late," she announced dramatically. Ethan smiled. "By 6 minutes. That is practically forever." She wrapped her arms around him. The stress of the day eased immediately. Some people found peace in vacations. Others found it in success. Ethan found it in simple moments like this. Inside, the smell of homemade macaroni and cheese filled the kitchen. Lily talked nonstop about school projects, spelling tests, and a science fair she was already nervous about. Ethan listened carefully, nodding and smiling when appropriate. But occasionally his thoughts drifted back to Building 3. Back to that sound. Back to the uneasy feeling he could not shake. Lily eventually noticed. Children often see what adults try to hide. She set down her fork and studied him. "Something wrong." Ethan looked up. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you keep staring at the wall." He laughed softly. "Do I?" "You do when you are thinking too hard." The answer lingered between them. Ethan glanced toward the window where darkness was slowly settling across the neighborhood. Somewhere beyond those distant hills, the factory lights would already be glowing against the night sky. Machines running, pressure building, systems working exactly as designed. Or so everyone believed. "It is nothing," he finally said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were not true. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Walker was beginning to wonder whether the factory was trying to tell him something that nobody else could hear. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. A cold wind swept across the factory grounds, carrying the scent of rain and steel. Ethan parked his pickup in the same spot he had used for years and sat for a moment with the engine off. Most people entered work thinking about deadlines, meetings, or paychecks. Ethan entered work listening. The uneasy feeling from the previous day had not faded overnight. If anything, it had grown stronger. By 6 o'clock, Building 3 was already alive with motion. Operators monitored control panels. Maintenance crews moved through service corridors. Pumps pushed thousands of gallons of industrial materials through miles of piping. The entire system functioned like a giant mechanical organism, each component depending on the next. Ethan began his route earlier than usual. He carried no special equipment, no advanced diagnostic device. Just his flashlight, his clipboard, and nearly 2 decades of experience. As he approached the transfer system again, he slowed his pace. The familiar hum surrounded him immediately. Valves opened and closed. Motors vibrated steadily. Pressure regulators clicked at predictable intervals. For several minutes, he heard nothing unusual. Then it happened. Click. The sound was brief, sharp, metallic, gone before anyone else could notice. Ethan froze. There it was again. Exactly the same as yesterday. His eyes moved toward a cluster of insulated pipes running along the east wall. Nothing appeared wrong. No visible damage. No warning lights. No leaks. No alarms. Yet something beneath the surface felt different. A younger technician named Brian walked past carrying a tablet. "Morning, Ethan." Ethan nodded. "You hear that?" Brian stopped. "Hear what?" The click. Brian listened for several seconds. The building hummed around them. Nothing else. He shrugged. "Sounds normal to me." Ethan thanked him anyway. The response was not surprising. Most people only noticed a sound when it became loud enough to demand attention. Ethan had learned long ago that serious problems often began as whispers. Later that morning, a facility-wide systems review was held inside the operations center. Large digital displays covered the walls. Real-time pressure readings scrolled continuously across multiple screens. Every indicator remained in the green zone. Production output was actually ahead of forecast. Claire Bennett stood near the center console reviewing safety reports. Unlike Derek, Claire carried herself with quiet authority. She was respected because she rarely spoke without reason. Every decision she made affected hundreds of employees. Every safety review carried weight. Ethan waited until she finished speaking with another supervisor. "Claire, do you have a minute?" She offered a polite smile. "Of course, Ethan." He appreciated that. Unlike some managers, Claire never treated him as invisible. "Something is bothering me in Building 3. Claire's expression shifted slightly. "The transfer system?" Ethan blinked. "You already heard?" "Derek mentioned your concern yesterday." Ethan nodded. "I think we need a closer inspection." Claire glanced toward one of the displays. Thousands of data points moved across the screen. Every measurement appeared normal. "What specifically are you seeing?" "Nothing." "Hearing?" Ethan hesitated. "A click." Claire waited. "Only a click." The question hung between them. Ethan understood how weak it sounded. One tiny noise against an ocean of information. One maintenance worker questioning an entire network of monitoring systems. Yet he could not ignore it. "The sound is changing," he said quietly. "It is subtle, but something is under stress." Claire folded her arms thoughtfully. She was not laughing. She was not dismissing him. But she was also not convinced. "I will review the maintenance history," she said. "That is all I can promise right now." Ethan thanked her and walked away. It should have made him feel better. It did not. Across the room, Derek watched the exchange from behind a workstation. A faint smile touched his face. Later that afternoon, Ethan discovered why. During a shift briefing, Derek addressed the engineering team. "Apparently, we are investigating phantom sounds now." Several people laughed. "Maybe we should start diagnosing equipment based on dreams while we are at it." More laughter followed. Ethan stood near the back of the room. He said nothing. The comments were not openly cruel. In some ways, they were worse. They transformed genuine concern into entertainment. Derek continued scrolling through production charts. Every sensor is normal. Every pressure reading is normal. Every inspection is normal. We are chasing ghosts. The meeting moved on. Yet something had changed. Ethan could feel it. The room no longer viewed his concern as a possibility. It had become a joke. As workers returned to their stations, conversations resumed. Smiles appeared. The factory continued operating exactly as before. But that evening, while walking through Building 3 one final time before heading home, Ethan heard the sound again. Click. This time it lasted slightly longer. Not enough for anyone else to notice. More than enough for him. He stood alone beside the transfer lines as the vibration traveled faintly through the steel beneath his fingertips. The sound disappeared into the machinery around him. Yet the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. And for the first time since this began, Ethan found himself wondering a question he could not answer. What if the machines were not failing to detect the problem? What if they were simply looking in the wrong place? That night, sleep came slowly. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Ethan's small house, while the old clock in the hallway counted each passing minute. The factory should have been far from his mind. He should have been thinking about Lily's science project or the grocery list taped to the refrigerator. Instead, he kept hearing the same sound. Click. Short. Sharp. Wrong. Around midnight, he finally gave up trying to sleep and walked quietly into the kitchen. The house rested in silence. He poured a glass of water and stared through the dark window toward the distant horizon where the faint glow of industrial lights painted the clouds. Somewhere beyond those hills, the plant continued operating through the night. Pumps turning, pressure building, production moving forward. The same system everyone trusted. The same system that was telling everyone there was nothing to worry about. Yet deep inside, Ethan felt a growing tension he could not explain. The next morning he arrived before most of the day's shift. The parking lot was nearly empty. Cold air drifted across the asphalt as he headed directly toward Building 3. He did not stop at the break room. He did not grab coffee. He wanted to listen before the facility reached full production levels. The building greeted him with its familiar chorus of mechanical sounds. For several minutes, he walked slowly along the transfer system. Everything appeared unchanged. Then he noticed something new. Not a sound. A vibration. Barely detectable. Ethan rested his fingertips against a support beam. The vibration pulsed through the steel for an instant before disappearing. He waited. 20 seconds later, it happened again. A tiny tremor. Like pressure searching for a place to escape. His jaw tightened. This was no longer just intuition. Something was happening. Before he could investigate further, his radio crackled. Maintenance team report to the conference room. Ethan glanced once more at the transfer lines before heading upstairs. Inside the conference room, managers and engineers gathered around a long table. Digital charts filled the screens along the walls. Derek stood confidently at the front. Claire sat near the center reviewing documents. The mood was optimistic. Production numbers were excellent. Investors were scheduled to visit the facility in less than a week. Corporate leadership had already praised the plant's performance. Everything pointed toward success. Derek clicked through a presentation. 0 safety incidents this quarter. Maximum output efficiency. All systems performing above expectations. Heads nodded around the room. Smiles appeared. Then Ethan raised his hand. The room quieted slightly. Derek sighed almost immediately. Yes, Ethan. Ethan remained calm. I think we need to inspect the transfer system internally. Several people exchanged looks. Derek folded his arms. Based on, the vibration is getting stronger. A few engineers glanced toward their screens. Derek pointed at the nearest display. Pressure readings remain normal. Ethan did not argue. I know. Temperature remains normal. I know. Flow rates remain normal. Ethan nodded. I know. Derek spread his hands dramatically. Then what exactly are we inspecting? The room grew uncomfortable. Claire watched silently. Ethan chose his words carefully. Something is changing inside the system. Derek laughed softly. Inside where? Ethan hesitated. That was the problem. He did not know. Not yet. The younger manager seized on the uncertainty immediately. You cannot shut down a facility because you have a feeling. Several people chuckled. Ethan heard it. So did Claire. The laughter was not cruel enough to be called bullying. It was worse. It carried the quiet confidence of people who believed they were smarter than the man speaking. Derek continued. Do you know how much a full inspection would cost? Ethan remained silent. Millions. Derek tapped the table. And that is before we even consider production delays. Nobody spoke. The decision was obvious to everyone except Ethan. Numbers favored continuing operations. Data favored continuing operations. Every screen in the room favored continuing operations. Derek smiled. We trust evidence here. Ethan looked around the room. Bright monitors reflected in polished glass. Charts moved across screens. Reports stacked neatly on tables. The entire factory was built upon measurements and calculations. Yet sometimes truth arrived before evidence did. Sometimes experience noticed what instruments missed. Ethan understood that. The room did not. Claire finally spoke. Her voice was calm. Let us at least review the maintenance records again. Derek nodded politely, but his expression revealed everything. He considered the matter settled. As the meeting ended, employees filed out discussing schedules and production goals. Ethan remained seated for a few seconds longer. Through the conference room window, he could see Building 3 in the distance. Pipes, valves, steel, quiet from this far away. Harmless, ordinary. Yet the uneasy feeling inside him had become impossible to ignore. Because for the first time since this began, he was no longer worried about being wrong. He was beginning to worry about what might happen if everyone else was. The drive home felt longer than usual. Gray clouds hung low over the highway as Ethan guided his pickup through the fading afternoon light. The factory disappeared behind him mile by mile, yet the weight he carried refused to stay there. Some worries fade when a shift ends. This one followed him home. By the time he pulled into the driveway, Lily was already waiting on the front porch. She sat cross-legged with a stack of poster boards beside her and markers scattered everywhere. The moment she saw his truck, her face brightened. "Perfect timing," she announced as he stepped out. "I need emergency scientific assistance." Ethan smiled despite himself. "That's serious?" "Extremely serious." She held up a cardboard volcano covered in red paint. "I think my lava looks depressed." For the next hour, the factory disappeared. They sat at the kitchen table cutting paper, gluing labels, and debating whether volcanoes should have more glitter. Lily talked endlessly while Ethan listened. It was one of the quiet gifts of parenthood. Children could pull you back into the present without even trying. Yet eventually she noticed the same thing she always noticed. The pause behind his smile. The distraction in his eyes. The thoughts he tried to hide. She lowered her marker. "You are worried again." Ethan looked down at the half-finished project. "Am I that obvious?" "To me." The answer carried no judgment, just truth. He leaned back in his chair. "There is something at work I cannot figure out." "Can you fix it?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. Normally, he would have answered immediately. This time he could not. "I do not know." Lily studied him carefully. "That is what scares you, right?" For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Children often ask simple questions that adults spend years avoiding. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe." The kitchen fell quiet. Rain tapped gently against the windows again. The old house creaked softly as evening settled in around them. Lily picked up one of her markers and drew a small star on the corner of her science project. "Mom used to say that when something feels wrong, you should not ignore it." Ethan looked at her. The mention of her mother always arrived unexpectedly. Not painful anymore, just tender. Lily continued coloring. She said, "Sometimes your heart notices things before your brain catches up." Ethan felt a faint smile touch his face. That sounds like her. They finished the project together, and eventually the evening drifted toward bedtime. After Lily fell asleep, Ethan remained awake. He sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing maintenance records he had printed earlier. Inspection reports, repair histories, component replacements. Nothing obvious appeared. Yet one detail finally caught his attention. 3 months earlier, a pressure regulation assembly inside Building 3 had undergone a partial refurbishment. Not a full replacement. Not a complete rebuild. Just enough work to keep operations moving. Ethan stared at the report for several minutes. The repair itself was not unusual. What bothered him was the timing. The component had already been operating well beyond its original service recommendation. He checked another document. Then another. A pattern slowly began to emerge. Small maintenance delays. Deferred inspections. Budget adjustments. Nothing alarming individually. Together they painted a different picture. The facility was not neglecting safety, but it was pushing efficiency harder than before. Ethan glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Common sense told him to go to bed. Instead, he grabbed his keys. 25 minutes later, he was parked outside the factory perimeter. The night shift was running. Security lights illuminated the sprawling industrial complex. Massive pipes stretched across the darkness like steel rivers. Ethan remained outside the fence for several moments, studying the facility from a distance. Then he noticed something. A maintenance access corridor near Building 3 remained illuminated, an area that should have been empty at this hour. Curiosity pulled him closer. After checking in with the night supervisor, he quietly entered the building. The atmosphere felt completely different after midnight. Fewer voices, fewer distractions. The machinery seemed louder somehow, more alive. Ethan followed the transfer lines again. The same pipes, the same supports, the same system that everyone insisted was operating perfectly. Then he heard it. Click. This time the sound arrived twice. Click, click. Ethan stopped instantly. His flashlight swept across the metal framework. Nothing visible. No warning lights. No leaking seals. No damaged fittings. Yet the vibration beneath his boots felt stronger than before. He crouched beside a support structure and placed his hand against the steel. The vibration answered immediately. Faint, Rhythmic. Unnatural. Ethan's pulse quickened. He was no longer listening for a possibility. He was listening to evidence. Somewhere inside the maze of metal and pressure, something was changing. Slowly, quietly, hidden from every screen and sensor the factory trusted. And for the first time since this began, Ethan realized he might be running out of time to convince anyone else. The vibration stayed with Ethan long after he left the building. Not in his hands, not in the steel, in his mind. The drive home before dawn felt unreal, as if two separate worlds were pulling him in opposite directions. One world was simple, a father raising his daughter, paying bills, going to work, living quietly. The other world was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. A world where every instinct he had developed over 17 years was telling him that something hidden was growing worse. By 7 o'clock that morning, he was back at the factory. The sky was pale and overcast. Employees streamed through the gates carrying coffee cups and lunch bags. Most of them looked tired. Some looked distracted. All of them trusted the facility around them. They trusted the walls, the equipment, the procedures, the experts. Ethan watched them enter and felt a knot tighten in his chest. Hundreds of people, mothers, fathers, young workers just starting their careers, men and women counting on the systems designed to keep them safe. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. Inside Building 3, production demand had increased overnight. New orders had pushed output targets even higher. Pumps worked harder. Pressure levels climbed closer to operational limits. Nothing exceeded approved ranges, but the margins felt thinner. The room seemed louder than before, more tense. Ethan followed the transfer system once again. The clicking sound appeared within minutes. Click. Pause. Click. The interval between sounds had shortened. He immediately pulled out his radio. Maintenance control, this is Walker. I need vibration diagnostics on the East Transfer Assembly. Static answered first. Then a supervisor replied. Diagnostics show normal operation. Ethan frowned. Run them again. Several moments passed. Results unchanged. No abnormalities detected. Ethan looked at the steel pipes stretching overhead. Everything appeared calm. Yet beneath that calmness, he could feel the faint trembling through the support structure. The machines were speaking. The computers simply were not hearing them. By mid-morning, Ethan requested another meeting. This time Derek was visibly irritated before the conversation even began. The engineering manager stepped into a hallway outside the operations center. What now? Ethan remained composed. The vibration is increasing. Derek rubbed his forehead. We have checked everything. Check again. Based on what? Ethan answered immediately. Because something is changing. Derek let out a short laugh. Not amused. Frustrated. You know what the real problem is? Ethan said nothing. Derek continued. You keep assuming experience is more reliable than evidence. The younger man pointed toward the control room. We have thermal monitoring, acoustic monitoring, pressure monitoring, predictive maintenance software. Entire teams analyzing data. His voice grew sharper. You have a feeling. The words hung in the air. Ethan met his gaze calmly. Sometimes feelings come from experience. Derek shook his head. Sometimes they come from fear. The conversation ended there. Neither man convinced the other. Yet as Ethan walked away, he noticed Claire standing near the doorway. She had heard enough to understand the tension. Later that afternoon, she approached him privately. They stood near a quiet maintenance corridor away from the noise of the main production floor. Tell me honestly, she said. How concerned are you? Ethan looked toward Building 3. He chose his words carefully. More concerned than yesterday. Claire studied him. That is not exactly reassuring. I know. Silence settled between them. Finally, she asked the question no one else had. Have you ever been wrong before? Ethan considered it. Many times. Claire nodded. Then why are you so certain now? For the first time, Ethan struggled to answer. Not because he lacked reasons. Because the reasons were difficult to explain. The sound, the vibration, the pattern, the instinct built over thousands of shifts and countless inspections. None of it translated neatly into charts. Because everything feels familiar, he said quietly. Claire frowned. Familiar? Ethan nodded. Years ago, I worked on a compressor failure at another facility. Nobody saw it coming. The data looked normal until it did not. Claire listened carefully. And this feels the same? Ethan looked down briefly. Worse. The answer lingered. Claire said nothing for several seconds. Then she exhaled slowly. I will review everything myself tonight. It was not a promise to shut anything down. It was not an endorsement of his concern, but it was the first time someone with authority had truly listened. For a moment, Ethan felt relief. It lasted less than an hour. Because near the end of the shift, as workers prepared for another production increase, the sound returned. Click, 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 3 times, closer together than ever before. Ethan stopped walking instantly. Nearby employees continued their tasks without noticing. Forklifts moved. Radios crackled. Machinery hummed. Life carried on. Yet beneath the noise, another sound was emerging. A warning growing louder. A message hidden inside steel and pressure. And for the first time since this began, Ethan realized he was no longer waiting for proof. Proof was already arriving. The real question was whether it would arrive before it was too late for anyone else to hear it. The factory felt different the next morning. Not because anyone else sensed danger. Not because alarms were sounding or supervisors were rushing through hallways. To everyone around him, it was another ordinary workday. Yet Ethan could feel the tension hiding beneath the surface of normalcy. The sky outside was clear for the first time in days. Sunlight reflected off rows of steel tanks and silver pipelines. Trucks arrived at loading docks. Workers exchanged greetings. Coffee cups steamed in tired hands. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. But inside Building 3, the rhythm had changed. Ethan noticed it immediately. The clicking sound no longer appeared as isolated interruptions. It had become part of the background. Faint, irregular, persistent, like a warning trying harder to be heard. He walked the transfer corridor twice before his shift officially began. Every pass confirmed the same thing. The vibration was stronger. Not dramatic, not visible, but undeniable. When he rested his hand against one support column, the trembling traveled directly into his fingertips. The sensation lingered even after he stepped away. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened. Pumps hummed, valves cycled, air handlers rattled overhead. Beneath it all, the hidden rhythm continued. Click, pause, click, click. Ethan opened his eyes. Whatever was happening inside the system was accelerating. Mid-morning brought another increase in production demand. Large monitors inside the control room displayed rising output targets. Operators adjusted settings. Supervisors approved new throughput levels. Everything remained technically within operational limits. Yet every adjustment pushed the system slightly harder than before. Claire arrived carrying a folder thick with maintenance records. Her expression was serious. She found Ethan near the maintenance workshop. I reviewed everything. Ethan waited. And Claire exhaled slowly. There are inconsistencies. Ethan felt a small surge of validation. Not relief. Validation. What kind? Deferred inspections. Temporary repairs that remained in place longer than recommended. Components operating beyond ideal replacement schedules. Ethan nodded. None of that surprised him anymore. Claire looked frustrated. Nothing severe enough to justify a shutdown. The words landed heavily between them. Because that was the problem. Every piece of evidence looked harmless by itself. Every individual decision appeared reasonable. Yet together they formed a picture neither of them liked. Claire rubbed her temple. I requested additional diagnostics this morning. What did they find? Nothing. Ethan looked away. The answer was becoming painfully familiar. Around noon, Derek entered the control room carrying a tablet and an unmistakable air of confidence. Several executives from corporate headquarters were scheduled to visit later that week. Production goals mattered more than ever. The last thing he wanted was uncertainty spreading through the workforce. He gathered supervisors near the main display wall. Good news, he announced. Our latest performance metrics are the strongest of the year. Smiles appeared immediately. People wanted good news, especially in a facility where success was measured every hour. Derek continued. The system is performing exactly as designed. His gaze drifted briefly toward Ethan. Despite certain rumors, a few employees chuckled. Others looked uncomfortable. Claire said nothing. Ethan remained silent. But the comment achieved its purpose. It drew a line between data and doubt, between certainty and caution. Most people naturally chose certainty. It felt safer, easier, cleaner. Yet as the afternoon progressed, something unexpected happened. A minor pressure fluctuation appeared on one of the secondary monitoring screens. It lasted less than 4 seconds before disappearing. Operators barely noticed it. Automated systems immediately compensated. The reading returned to normal. There, Ethan said quietly. Claire looked up. What? He pointed toward the display. Did you see it? Claire had. Her eyes narrowed. It corrected itself. Ethan nodded. Maybe. An hour later, another fluctuation appeared. Then another. Tiny. Brief. Easy to dismiss. Yet each one seemed to originate from the same section of the transfer network. Building 3. The room grew subtly quieter each time it happened. Not because anyone admitted concern. Because uncertainty had finally entered the conversation. Even Derek appeared slightly less relaxed than before. By late afternoon, Ethan returned once more to the corridor where the clicking had first begun. The building seemed louder than ever. Machinery strained against rising demand. Vibrations traveled through steel supports. Warm air carried the smell of lubricants and heated metal. Ethan stood alone beneath a maze of overhead piping and listened. Click, click, click. The sound came faster now. Not constant, but closer together. The gap between warnings was shrinking. He felt a chill despite the warmth inside the building. Then his radio crackled unexpectedly. Walker, report to the operations center immediately. The voice sounded urgent. Ethan turned and started walking. Around him, workers continued their routines, unaware that something was changing, unaware that the careful balance everyone trusted might be shifting beneath their feet. And as he moved through the crowded corridors toward the control room, one thought echoed louder than the machinery around him. For days he had been trying to convince people that something was wrong. Now he feared the factory itself might be starting to agree. When Ethan stepped into the operations center, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter. Faces were more serious. The confidence that had filled the room only hours earlier seemed thinner now, stretched across growing uncertainty. Large monitors continued displaying production data, but more eyes were watching them than before. Claire stood near the main console, with several supervisors gathered around her. Derek was already there, his jaw tight as he reviewed a stream of incoming diagnostics. Ethan immediately noticed a new graph flashing on one of the side screens. Tiny fluctuations continued appearing across the transfer network, small enough to remain within acceptable limits, frequent enough to make people uncomfortable. Claire turned toward him. We are seeing intermittent pressure instability. Ethan nodded. Where? A supervisor pointed toward the display. Building 3. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody made jokes about feelings or phantom sounds. The room had moved beyond that stage, not into belief, into uncertainty. And uncertainty can be far more dangerous. Derek quickly regained control of the conversation. The system is compensating exactly as designed. He tapped the screen. Every fluctuation corrects itself. One of the operators nodded. Technically, he is right. Claire remained focused on the data. But the frequency is increasing. The room fell silent again. Ethan watched the graphs carefully. The fluctuations looked random to most people. They did not look random to him. They looked like symptoms. Like a machine trying to tell a story one small piece at a time. Throughout the afternoon, additional inspection teams were dispatched into Building 3. Sensors were recalibrated. Software was reviewed. Mechanical access points were examined. Every report returned with the same conclusion. No identifiable fault. No visible damage. No justification for a shutdown. The lack of answers only deepened the tension. By early evening, the facility felt caught between two realities. One reality was the data. The numbers insisted everything remained under control. The other reality was harder to measure. Workers had started noticing the unusual activity. Questions spread through break rooms and maintenance shops. Supervisors reassured employees that everything was fine. Yet reassurance repeated too often can begin sounding like concern. Ethan spent most of the evening walking the transfer corridor. The clicking had become impossible for him to ignore. Click. Pause. Click. Click. Sometimes the sound arrived from one section of piping. Sometimes another. It was as if the entire system was carrying stress through hidden pathways beneath the surface. Around 7 o'clock, Claire joined him inside Building 3. The fluorescent lights reflected off rows of steel supports. Warm air drifted through the corridor. For several moments, neither of them spoke. They simply listened. Then it happened again. Click. Claire's eyes narrowed immediately. I heard that. Ethan looked at her. It was the first time someone else had heard it without being told. The sound came again several seconds later. slightly louder. Claire stepped closer to the piping network. That is not normal. Ethan said nothing. He did not need to. For days he had been trying to explain something that words could not capture. Now the machine itself was speaking clearly enough for someone else to hear. Claire immediately contacted the operations center. Additional inspections were ordered. More reviews. More diagnostics. Yet even now, the results remained frustratingly incomplete. Every path led back to the same problem. Evidence existed. Proof did not. The difference mattered, especially when millions of dollars in production hung in the balance. An emergency management meeting was called shortly before nightfall. Executives joined remotely. Supervisors gathered around conference tables. Reports were presented. Charts were reviewed. Opinions divided. Ethan was not invited into the room. He sat alone in a maintenance office down the hall. The decision about the facility's future was being made without him. Through the closed door, he occasionally heard raised voices. Fragments of conversation. Words like risk, probability, liability, cost. Not once did he hear anyone mention trust. Not once did he hear anyone mention responsibility. Eventually, the door opened. Managers emerged looking exhausted. Claire followed behind them. Ethan stood immediately. Her expression told him everything before she spoke. They voted against a shutdown. The words landed heavily. Ethan looked away. For a moment, neither person spoke. Outside the office window, darkness had fully settled across the facility. Bright industrial lights illuminated the maze of pipes and processing units. The factory continued operating. Production continued. Pressure continued building. Claire's voice was quieter now. They want more data. Ethan nodded slowly. Of course they do. She looked genuinely troubled. I argued for a temporary pause. And Claire sighed. I lost. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Not because Ethan was angry. Because he understood exactly how these decisions happened. Nobody in that meeting wanted to make the wrong choice. Nobody wanted to risk jobs, profits, or reputations. Yet sometimes doing nothing feels safer than acting, even when it is not. Several minutes later, Ethan returned to Building 3 one more time before the end of his shift. The corridor stood nearly empty now. The machinery continued its endless work beneath the harsh white lights. He stopped beside the same section of piping where everything had begun. Then he heard it. Click, click, click. Faster than before. Closer together. The sound echoed through the steel like a ticking clock hidden behind a wall. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. For days he had been chasing uncertainty. Now uncertainty was disappearing. Something was changing. Something real. Something dangerous. And somewhere inside the vast machinery surrounding him, a countdown had already begun. The countdown ended just after midnight. Not with chaos. Not with panic. With a choice. Ethan stood alone beside the transfer corridor listening to the now relentless clicking hidden inside the steel. Click, click, click. Every instinct he possessed was screaming the same message. There was no more time. He reached for his radio one final time. Control room, this is Walker. We need an immediate shutdown. Static answered. Then a familiar voice. Derek. Negative. Continue monitoring. Ethan closed his eyes. The response did not surprise him. For days he had asked, warned, explained, waited. The system had answered with meetings, reports, and delays. But the machine itself was no longer asking for permission. It was giving a warning. Ethan turned and moved quickly toward the nearest emergency control station. The corridor seemed strangely quiet despite the constant hum surrounding him. Every step felt heavier than the last. He knew exactly what would happen next. If he was wrong, he would likely lose the job he had spent 17 years building. If he was right, the consequences of waiting were impossible to ignore. He thought of Lily. Her science projects spread across the kitchen table. Her laughter. Her faith in him. He thought of the hundreds of people who would arrive tomorrow expecting another ordinary day. Then he made his decision. Moments later, alarms began sounding across the facility. Not warning alarms. Shutdown alarms. Pumps powered down. Transfer systems isolated. Production lines halted one after another. Across the plant, confusion spread instantly. Supervisors rushed into hallways. Operators stared at darkening displays. Radios erupted with overlapping voices. Within minutes, security officers found Ethan near the control station. He offered no resistance. No argument. No speech. He simply stood there calmly while questions flew around him. Why did you do it? Who authorized this? Do you realize what this will cost? Ethan answered only once. I heard something nobody else did. The hours that followed felt endless. Engineers inspected the transfer system from end to end. Specialized diagnostic teams arrived before sunrise. The facility remained shut down. Executives demanded explanations. Reports were filed. Statements were taken. Ethan sat quietly in a small security office while the investigation unfolded beyond closed doors. Nobody thanked him. Nobody defended him. Most people assumed the same thing. He had overreacted. Then shortly after dawn, everything changed. A senior inspection engineer entered the operations center carrying a report. The room fell silent before he even spoke. Deep inside a section of the transfer assembly, hidden beneath insulation and inaccessible during routine inspections, investigators had discovered a growing structural failure. Tiny at first, nearly invisible, yet significant enough that continued operation under increasing pressure could have led to a serious system event. The clicking sound, the vibration, the fluctuations. Every warning Ethan had heard had been real. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Claire sat motionless staring at the report. Derek looked as though the air had left his lungs. The evidence they had demanded for days now sat directly in front of them. And it had arrived because one maintenance worker trusted experience over comfort. By mid-morning, the entire facility knew. Conversations stopped when Ethan walked through hallways. People who had laughed avoided his eyes. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. The loudest reaction was not applause. It was silence. The kind of silence that follows truth. Several days later, the company held a gathering inside the main operations building. Executives spoke. Safety leaders spoke. Engineers spoke. Claire stepped forward last. Her voice carried through the room with calm honesty. For years we trusted our systems. We should have. They are important. But this week reminded us that technology is only part of safety. Character matters. Experience matters. Listening matters. Then she turned toward Ethan. And sometimes the person who sees the truth first is not the one standing at the front of the room. No grand speech followed. No dramatic celebration. That was never Ethan's way. The next morning he returned to work exactly as he always had. Same pickup truck. Same lunchbox. Same quiet walk through the factory gates. Yet something was different. Workers paused to shake his hand. Supervisors greeted him by name. Even Derek approached him near Building 3. The younger man looked uncomfortable. Humble. Human. I should have listened, he said quietly. Ethan studied him for a moment and then nodded. Now you will. Nothing more needed to be said. That evening, Ethan drove home beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun. Lily met him on the porch carrying her science project. Did everything work out? She asked. Ethan smiled. A genuine smile this time. Yes, sweetheart. It did. Together they walked inside. The house smelled like dinner. The world felt peaceful again. And somewhere far behind them, a factory continued running safely because one ordinary father chose courage over convenience and responsibility over silence. Sometimes dignity does not arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the moment people finally understand the value of a voice they almost ignored. If this story reminded you that character matters more than titles, and that quiet strength often hides in ordinary people, share your thoughts below. And if stories about dignity, second chances, and everyday heroes speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.